Well, thank you very much, Drew. I'm sort of over-equipped, as you can see, with all these things. I don't think I've ever had to deal with 2 sets and 4 machines on me, but we'll manage. Thank you very much. Drew is indeed an old friend, and I'm very happy to be here in his new environment, far away from the water. Though I did enjoy that. He also saved me that time. It wasn't just the surfer. He was also part of it. And so that's, this is a paper that I did originally for a Singapore conference on sort of Singapore, as some of you may know, is really positioning itself as the Brussels of Asia. That is to say, it is trying to position itself as the leader of Asian integration, and wants to sort of think about it at multiple levels, politically, economically, mostly economically, but also culturally and politically. And so it's been interesting to speak to them and to talk. And so in some ways we can think of this paper as having with that background in mind, right? I mean, what is the role, what are the relations between India and China, what is their role in Asia, particularly that historical Asia, which of course includes mostly Southeast Asia, but of course, as Drew points out with the camel connection, also involves a lot of Central Asia and the Middle East in its historical relations. And so when we do, when you're listening to this, keep that in the back of your mind, and I will come to issues of new forms of integration and new opportunities, as well as new crises that are emerging in the new Asia. Okay, Chinese and Indian leaders of the mid-20th century saw it as their destiny to transform not only themselves, but the world, as their anti-imperialist consciousness became intertwined with their self-perception as inheritors of 2 great world civilizations. Decolonization presented an opportunity for these nations to offer an alternative to the colonial past. Unlike leaders in Southeast Asian countries, Indian leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, you'll come across these names later on the screen, so you can write them down then, regarded India in the immediate post-war period as equally qualified with China to lead Asia and the decolonizing world. Indeed, after 1949, Nehru sought to exercise this leadership precisely by bringing communist China into a realm of engagement with non-communist societies in Asia and the West. This scenario, however, changed rapidly during the 1950s, and India soon found itself preoccupied with issues in South Asia itself. In this lecture, I want to outline how the Chinese leadership was effective in utilizing the Westphalian type model of international relations, which I will spell out as the 5 principles of Panchashila, which was the period, which was the model of international relations pioneered by these decolonizing nations. So how it was effective in utilizing this Westphalian type Panchashila model of international relations to further its interests in the relations between the 2 nation states in recent years. To further its interests among its neighbors while confining India to South Asia. Now remember, South Asia is not Southeast Asia, right? Sometimes people get confused. Let me go to the map. This, as you can see, is the map of China, of the contemporary Chinese People's Republic of China, as well as the old imperial Qing China. And I just want you to note where, oops, got the wrong one, where Xizang, this is Tibet, this is Mongolia, as you can see, this is Inner Mongolia or Neimang. This is all in Chinese. I guess this is all a Putonghua map. and Pinyin map, Xinjiang. So these are the peripheral areas, and this, of course, is Southeast Asia. You can see how close. And this is the shared border with all these Himalayan states like Bhutan, Sikkim, which is now part of India, Nepal, Kashmir, and so on. All of these will become important, as are the Southeast Asian, in this discussion. But let me go here to show you what the historical sort of border areas between India, China, and this is China, and these are the Southeast Asian states. Right? So what we mean by South Asia really is not this part, which is Southeast Asia, but the states of Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka. So this area is South Asia. So improvement in the relations between China and India in recent years, and the concomitant growth in the status of India in South, Southeast, and East Asia has led to a reconfiguration of the political scenario. Ironically, it is precisely at this moment when the two giants are developing the capacity to realize some version of the decolonization ideals that these ideals have actually dimmed in Asian societies. So it's an irony, a sad irony, I think. As such, the reconfiguration presents a cauldron of both opportunities and risks for the region as a whole. Now this first part is called the early period, ideals and problems. The transformation of decolonizing societies into nation states, a process that accompanied the idealism of the anti-imperialist movement, actually generated inescapable tensions. The Westphalian system of nation states, with its ideal of self-regulating, competitive, sovereign units, only partially reflected the entire range of relations between where it started, the European states, even during the 20th century. Despite the theory of mutual respect in the Westphalian system, these states were engaged in a competition for resources that entailed not only military conquest and colonization, but also annexation or domination of each other's territories. Moreover, in a recent reflection, one of the great exponents of the Westphalian system in the post-war era, Adam Watson, notes that the hegemonic powers within the Westphalian system, whether it was England or France or whoever, or the Dutch before, the Westphalian system always aimed to modify the internal behavior of other states and communities, a distinctly un-Westphalian activity which was supposed to respect the sovereignty of these entities. Viewed from the outside, it seems that the Westphalian system had the unacknowledged function of restricting access differentially to resources in the world, particularly through colonial control. Not only were polities that were not part of or were not allowed into the system regarded as controlled colonial resources, but through both formal agreements and extra-treaty actions and violence, states established their political and economic dominance in the system. Resistance to hegemony by aspiring powers entailed considerable violation of the rules of the system, as in the well-known cases of Germany, Japan, and others. Indeed, following world systems theorists, I have argued that by the late 19th century, there developed an intrinsic relationship between imperialism and nationalism. In the competition for resources, mobilizing the nation marshaled material and psychological resources for imperialist conquest, while imperialism abroad furthered nationalism and national power. This kind of competitive pressure often led to the breakdown of the system, as during the two world wars. Thus, participation in a system of nation states meant participating in a system which had historically been based upon the integration of imperialism and nationalism. How then could the new states, the new decolonizing states, enter a competitive system without being imperialistic? One could argue that external competition was not necessary to the new iteration of the Westphalian system in the United Nations model. To some extent, this is undoubtedly true. China, following the Soviet Union, was avowedly built upon non-capitalist foundations, and the onset of the Cold War gave new nations such as India the idea and space for autarkic development. But competition had deeper roots than capitalist economics in modern society. By the 19th century, nations came to be premised upon a progressive vision of history that promised endless growth. Even if this growth was not based on a zero-sum game model, it involved competition on the part of the nation for scarce resources and status. Growth entailed expansionism that was not only territorial and economic, but had political and psychological dimensions. Thus, even though the People's Republic of China denounced the international system as capitalistic, it was invested in the entire narrative of progress and competition. This sanctioned the mobilization of people to produce and sacrifice for the socialist nation. Note the 1958 Great Leap Forward slogan to overtake steel production in Britain and France in 15 years. The construction of socialism around the nation state and its discursive commitment to a linear history and progressive future entailed a competitive understanding of the world, which would, under particular historical circumstances, enable both unconditional nationalism and capitalism to prevail. Gandhi had a deeper critique of modernity and its assumptions about history, masculinity, and progress. But his program of self-sufficient communities was hardly a practicable idea, and it was easily incorporated and marginalized by the other vision in India of a modern industrial future for India, espoused by people like Nehru. Under these circumstances, was there much room, if you will, for alternative modernities? How did the structure of a competitive nation-state system constrain the ideological choices of society? What were these alternatives? For the China, the goal of its leadership of the anti-imperialist movement was to produce revolutionary socialist societies among the decolonizing nations. For India, the goal was to realize the Nehru-Gandhi ideals of peace, non-alignment, and constitutionalism. From an outcome-blind 1950s perspective, India's nuclear program was almost as unexpected as China's turn to capitalism. Both believed that their recent historical achievements, as well as their deeper historical greatness, entitled them to lead the new nations of the world along alternative paths. Well, we'll see how much alternative there is. As early as 1947, just as India was achieving independence, India held the first Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi, when it put together a series of exhibitions revealing the greatness and influence of Indian culture, religion, and trade that had extended from the Himalayas to Southeast Asia and Persia and Central Asia. There's perhaps no better expression of this cosmopolitanism, of this ancient Indian cosmopolitanism, than the Buddhist University of Nalanda, which collected scholars from this entire religio-intellectual universe and included the famous Chinese monks Xuanzang and Faxian from the 5th to the 12th centuries. Now it's very interesting. Singapore is of course in the forefront of leading to the revival of Nalanda and creating a Pan-Asian kind of university based on this. So these are some of the remaining sites of Nalanda from the, I guess these are structures from the 12th century at the latest, and this is of course not where the university is now, but it's around there. This was the original site. Indians were particularly proud of their historic influence in Southeast Asia. They imagined the perfection of Indian civilization in the past of this greater Sanskritic world, or even empire, which was all the better for it to have been made not by power and wealth, but by ideas and values. The struggling KMT regime, this is, remember, 1947, they're about to lose power by 1949, in China, sent a delegation to the conference and was quick to match the Indian claims with still more extensive ones. The Chinese narrative of greatness derived not only from imperial China having exerted a wide civilizing influence across much of Asia, but also having extended through the tribute system considerable political and economic power over the regions. And Drew just mentioned the voyages of Zheng He, the expeditions of Zheng He, and which you will hear more about in 2 weeks. But you can see here the main routes that he went across. You can see how I guess it begins here from Nanjing and to Canton, to parts of Southeast Asia. You can see here Vietnam, which is of course historically had a very strong Chinese influence, whereas Indic influence have been more predominant in the other parts. And then through these straits kingdoms, these maritime empires in the strait areas, all the way to then the Bay of Bengal, different parts of India, and all the way to East Africa. Indeed, the most, Zheng He, which was carried out during the Ming Dynasty. Although there are some fantasy accounts of the expeditions having reached the Americas, there's a recent book which I don't think deserves too much serious attention. But it is clear that they reached the Cape of Good Hope before the Portuguese did, and so these were no mean achievements at that time. To be sure, the earlier Republican, that is Chinese Republican from 1911 to 1949, narratives of tributary sovereignty, I'll be talking a little bit about, so let me give you the timeline for those of you who are not that familiar. So the Republican period starts from 1912, the fall of the Qing dynasty. And so the earlier Republican narratives of tributary sovereignty and heroic Chinese pioneers settling and civilizing the Southeast Asian regions were not foregrounded by the communists, right? They didn't want to push that old, we were the imperialist settlers in Southeast Asia. Indeed, both the Indians and Chinese quickly learned that these civilizing narratives could only be perceived by Southeast Asians as reproducing familiar patterns of imperialist behavior. However, during the early People's Republic of China after 1949, since China's geopolitical influence was hampered in the east by Japan and in the north and west by the Soviet Union, its best chance to establish itself as a regional power was in fact Southeast Asia. I would add that the Himalayan region also represented another, though lesser, geopolitical zone of potential influence. Thus, both India and China had what we might call civilizational narratives which justified the leadership of each to the decolonizing world. Between the late 1940s until the Bandung Conference of 1955, you all got enough of this? We can go back. The Bandung Conference will come back to Nehru and Joe. Of 1955, as you can see here, this is the conference of 29 Asian and African nations to promote economic and cultural cooperation. The aim was also to oppose European colonialism and the new imperialism of the US and Soviet Union. So it is a movement of non-alignment that was that these decolonizing nations, and which India and China and Indonesia wanted to lead. So between the 40s and the Bandung Conference, both states conducted a flurry of diplomatic exchanges and events to build the organizational basis to achieve their goals. The government of India continued to conduct conferences of Asian societies, whereas the People's Republic of China held the World Federation of Trade Unions. It was much more a working class, much more a revolutionary perspective on this. An effort to bring trade unions across the world into a single international organization, not unlike the UN. It was like a sort of a parallel UN of the working peoples in Beijing as early as November 1949, so very soon, in 1 month after the revolution. Burmese socialists also took the lead in organizing the Asian Socialist Conferences, which brought together Asian socialist parties and sought to more actively include Africa in the decolonizing movement, as well as create the basis for China's participation in the Bandung Conference. See, there was this question about whether if China was a revolutionary socialist nation, then, I mean, should it be in a non-aligned movement? After all, it was aligned to the socialist Soviet Union, right? And this was the great triumph, both of those who were managing China's participation, like Nehru and Indonesians and the Burmese, as well as Zhou Enlai and the Chinese, to actually say that China was both. It was on the socialist camp, but was also a decolonizing nation, right? By the time of this landmark Bandung Conference of 1955, civilizational chauvinism was kept in check, and the leaders of the two nations unfolded their approaches and messages to the decolonizing world. As is well known, contrary to expectations, it was Zhou Enlai who succeeded in achieving the moral high ground, while Nehru was unable to extricate the Indian side from the arguments with the Pakistanis. So this is Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, the first Prime Minister, as you can see here, and that's Zhou Enlai, first Premier of China, and we'll come back to this in a bit. Indeed, I think it is fair to say that from the time of Bandung, India's status in Southeast Asia never did rise much higher until recent times. From the end of the Bandung Conference, immersed in its problems within South Asia and the Himalayan regions, India developed no coherent policy towards Southeast Asia, much less a sphere of influence, and declined in importance in that region. In part, the close relationship that developed between China and Pakistan. Actually, this is very important to note in the sense that, you know, we always think about how many overseas Chinese there are in Southeast Asia. There probably, if you look at certain countries in Southeast Asia, there are probably more Indians than Chinese, and yet, you know, they had no interest in it. So that's an instructive difference. In part, the close relationship that developed between China and Pakistan succeeded in keeping Indian strategic concerns within South Asia for most of the post-independence period. In the next part of the paper, I argue that in this period, it is less fruitful to compare the two countries, India and China, than to explore their relationships. China became involved in the effort to engage Indian concerns within South Asia, and India found it difficult to exercise its hegemony even within that region. For over 30 years, India was unable to extricate itself or exercise sufficient leadership to break through this containment. So this part is now called territorial consolidation. Let me show you some other pictures of Bandung they have. This is also a very important moment for bringing in a lot of African leaders, although there was a conflict and most of them were not yet decolonized. African decolonization had to took place in the 60s. But particularly Middle East and the whole China, Islamic, Middle East, or not Islamic, Middle East nation connection was forged here with Nasser. There you can see Nasser of Egypt. These were giants, Zhou and Nehru again, and these are a lot of the Southeast Asian leaders, Sukarno and U Thant and people like that, Burmese and others. Let's see if I have any more. No. Excuse me, I'm not used to giving these PowerPoint presentations. I've just started doing them, and so I sometimes find it hard to go back and forth. I lose my place. But it's worth it, I think, right? The alternative civilizational goals towards which the leadership of India and China aspired to guide the new nations remained in uneasy tension with the task of nation and state building. We're back to the old problem of nationalism and imperialism. How do you get out of that bind, right? The first of these tasks was the definition and consolidation of national territory. The PRC had the advantage of drawing upon half a century of thinking on this question during the Republic and during the KMT period. The KMT, which actually controlled a small part of the Chinese territory, nonetheless claimed not only the Qing Empire, which is what the present People's Republic of China is, but regions that were part of the Qing and pre-Qing tribute system and beyond, including what they call the lost territories, which includes most of Burma, some parts of northern India, parts of Afghanistan, parts of Iran. I mean, you know, some of their maps are very extensive, and I don't think they're keen on showing them to anybody right now. The People's Republic of China, however, tends to stick to the extent of the Qing Empire. However, the Qing Empire was not a nation state, and there ensued the problem of what I call incommensurable sovereignty, right? For decolonizing nations emerging from old empires, such as the Qing or the British Empire, the territorial problem was the most enduring. Nationalists of the dominant ethnicity or group made claims upon regions or territories of the old empire, but it was practically difficult for Indians and Chinese nationalists to extend or sustain the principle of nationality in several parts of the old empire. The peripheral regions of the Qing Empire, whether in Tibet, Mongolia, let's go back to the first maps. Tibet, here you see here, Tibet, Mongolia, what I pointed out earlier, or Xinjiang, had multiple and flexible political affiliations, and incorporation into the empire was often based upon patronage of common religious or other cultural symbols, rather than the modern conception of absolute belonging to a territorial nation. Similarly, the British Indian Empire incorporated regions and communities along lines of differentiation that enabled the Muslims of the empire to deny any obligation to the successor Indian state, which they claim was going to be predominantly Hindu. The northern Himalayan states of Kashmir, Nepal, so these are the states that I've been talking about, which are still problems, Kashmir, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, remained nominally sovereign, but were dependencies of the British government in India. Strategically, this vast region and Tibet, right, served as a buffer for the British imperial government, which was focused on protecting India from other, especially Russian imperial power. In other words, the principle of belonging to a national territory was incommensurate with the historical practice of loose affiliations and flexible incorporation into empire. Moreover, dominant nationalists were often making their claims on these regions precisely at a time when elites of these regions or communities, such as the Mongols or the British Indian Muslims, were also developing a national consciousness, right? This was the basis, for instance, of the rejection by Muslims of British Indian Empire to join with the Republic of India, the Tibetan and Mongol refusal to participate in a Chinese nation, and so on. The contestation over claimed territories is also a reminder of the difficulty of separating or containing the differences between nationalism and imperialism. Between real independence of the periphery and its full incorporation, there were, of course, other modalities of dealing with the incommensurability problem, but they were often unsatisfactory. The Republic of India was forced to relinquish the territories to Pakistan, seized much of Kashmir and several other princely states, and entered into treaties with Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim that essentially restored their status as buffer states that the British had created. In 1973, India incorporated Sikkim, and it's just only last year that Sikkim's incorporation was recognized by China. As with India, China too developed border differences with most of its contiguous states. But the most publicized and dramatic problem was, of course, the Tibetan one. The history of the Chinese incorporation of Tibet is not something I will go into here. It is, however, instructive to follow how China sought to contain or limit the effects of its forceful integration of the periphery on its relations with its neighbor and continue to sustain its anti-imperialist rhetoric. The doctrine used by the Chinese leadership to produce this effect was the doctrine of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, or Panchashila. Panchshila is the Sanskrit word, 5 principles, which is also used by many Southeast Asian countries, like Indonesia, for instance, as 5 principles. So they signed their first peace treaty based on and it's, in fact, India recognized the Chinese sovereignty of Tibet. The 5 principles include things like mutual respect among nations, peaceful coexistence, equality, mutual non-aggression, and non-interference in internal affairs. It originated in the treaty known, as you can see here, the Agreement between Republic of India and People's Republic of China on trade and intercourse between the Tibetan region of China, and which India signed on April 29, 1954. Later, Nehru would publicize it widely and make it the core of New India's civilizational message in Bandung and elsewhere as the guiding philosophy of the non-aligned movement. As we know, it was of great significance to the political philosophy of the Indonesian state. Panchshila was a kind of a Westphalian doctrine for the era of decolonization. The goal was to enable states to engage in relationships by setting aside troublesome or insoluble issues. In contrast to the Westphalian era, when most of the world was prey to a few nation states, this time around what seemed fairer about it was the fact that most of the world was becoming divided up into nation states. Nonetheless, it could still be used instrumentally by forcibly incorporating a contested region and declaring it to be part of the national territory, as both China and India were to do. Despite India's flaunting of the rhetoric, the Chinese government utilized the 5 principles more effectively. I do a little bit about how the Chinese regime was had a tradition of working with. We think of the Chinese regime as having been mainly focused on revolutionary international order, but in fact you had a long tradition through the Republic of diplomats like Wellington Koo, Alfred Tse, W.W. Yen and so on, who had actually worked and realized the possibilities of international laws to achieve a place for China in the world. I believe that the idea of Panchshila, for the Chinese at least, was continuous with the conviction in the demonstrated value of law as a means of securing state sovereignty. In the view of the communists, pre-World War II international law was imperialistic and could not fully secure China's sovereignty. Panchshila was better in that regard. It was anti-imperialist but gave the state full autonomy within its claimed sovereign territory. Thus, once the Chinese government obtained recognition by India of its claim to Tibet in the 1954 treaty, it proceeded entirely on the supposition that China acted within Panchshila principles, whereas it could claim that India, by asserting rights over Himalayan states, was engaging in hegemonism. In staking this high ground, the PRC regime ignored 2 historical realities, neither of which was fully commensurable with modern principles. The first was that for most of the past century, the entire Himalayan region had become a vast buffer zone between the British, Russian and Qing empires. From the Indian perspectives, the Chinese had acquired the largest of these buffers in Tibet. Why should they deny the right to Indians to regard the Himalayan kingdoms as their buffer? Second, and more profoundly, but the Indians never secured a treaty with the Chinese to say that this is in fact our territory or something like that, right? Second, and more profoundly, there was an asymmetry in the Chinese perception of the 2 empires. The British Empire was regarded by the PRC as imperialist, whereas the Qing Empire was seen as proto-nationalist. We know well, however, that the Republican Revolution of 1911 saw the Manchus as barbarian alien conquerors. Looking back at the 1950s, it would seem that Nehru, who appeared to determine foreign policy, like Mao and Zhou in China. This is before the bureaucratization of foreign policy and things like that. Nehru seemed to have very little sense of statecraft. From Sardar Patel, the Iron Man of India, whose tough-minded advice on China Nehru never took in the 50s, to Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh at the end of the 20th century, the early foreign policy of the Republic of India has been criticized for having been overly influenced by the unrealistic Gandhian notion of pacifism and idealism. The main charge has been that Nehru naively trusted the PRC leadership, beginning with the concession of China's central demand on the recognition of Tibet. Once this became a fait accompli, India had little basis on which to negotiate the border issues that became the cause of flare-up and war between India and China in 1962. To be sure, the Indian leadership's inexperience with foreign policy matters had much to do with Nehru's naive China policy, if that is what it was. At the same time, however, bringing the PRC into the international arena dominated by the US and Western powers by promoting China's cause in the UN, the Korean War, and Bandung, the period known in India as the period of India-China friendship, or Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, was a crucial part of Nehru's strategy of exercising leadership in the new bloc of decolonized nations. It is fairer to say that Nehru's strategy backfired. The Sino-Indian conflict of 1962 caused a reversal in Indian attitudes towards China and put Indian policy towards its neighbors firmly on a realpolitik track. The policy of militarily absorbing its small neighbors, Goa and Sikkim, of helping bisect Pakistan, by creating Bangladesh, by helping the creation of Bangladesh, through military intervention, the military intervention in Sri Lanka in 1987, the economic sanctions that crippled Nepal when the country sought to develop independent military ties with China in 1987, and the nuclear tests of 1998 leave no doubt about a much tougher attitude towards South Asian arena, which India sought forcibly to establish as its sphere of influence. From another angle, Indian realpolitik may be seen to have represented its containment within South Asia, and one might even see India as being mired in an area much smaller than that envisioned by Nehru and other founders. Two factors need to be considered in the shrinking of India's Asian role to South Asia. The first seems to be a failure to imagine its role in the wider region, especially after the disappointments of the non-aligned movement. India made no effort to join any regional organization in Southeast Asia after Bandung. Even with respect to the people of Indian origins in the region, and in marked contrast to the Chinese efforts to protect and woo the overseas Chinese population in Southeast Asia ever since the early 20th century, the government of the Republic of India was decidedly myopic in its view of ethnic Indians in Southeast Asia, or for that matter in Africa or elsewhere in the Middle East. Career diplomat Badruddin Tayyabji wrote, I quote, I realize how superficial, how ill-informed, almost callous the view had been. Above all, how far we had failed in utilizing this enormous reservoir of Indian capital, men, money, skills, energy, and know-how overseas for building up the new India of our 5-year plans, our foreign policy, and our conception of international affairs. Indeed, the Indian Overseas Department, established by the British Indian government, was dismantled and replaced with consular institutions which tended to see these people as mere liabilities. The second factor has been the alliance between China and Pakistan, which has kept India busy in South Asia. John Garver has stated that the Sino-Pakistani relationship has probably been the most durable of all China's foreign relationships, I would say until recently. Pakistan has been the recipient of covert nuclear technology from China and is the largest recipient of Chinese military aid. Moreover, China has supported insurrectionary movements in India through the Cultural Revolution. India's intransigence on China's proposal to conduct an East-West swap on the Himalayan border issue, and China's refusal to recognize until recently India's claim of special relations with the Himalayan kingdoms, has kept India focused on its vast northern border. Okay, now I'll talk about Asia. Now we're going to jump. Asia after Deng Xiaoping, right? Asia from the 90s, let's say. Let me see what other pictures I have here. Okay, that's a good one. Deng Xiaoping and the New China. This is the end of the Maoist period, the Cultural Revolution, height of Maoist revolutionary politics and strategy. Then the Deng Xiaoping and reforms begin in 1979, but one of the very important differences really begins in the 1990s, leading up to, of course, China's joining the WTO. As is well known, the ascendancy of Deng Xiaoping in Chinese politics led to a sea change in China's foreign relations as well. Over the 1980s, the support of revolutionary movements by China in other countries was given up. A series of bilateral negotiations were initiated to ease border and political tensions, and the focus turned to trade and investment. This has not only led to significant reduction of fears about the Chinese threat over most of Asia, and the Chinese government now calls it the peaceful rise of China, right? It inspired the Indians to respond and learn from the Chinese experience. And like the rest of Asia, India too has now become economically invested in the peaceful rise of China. There are two dimensions of this new chapter that appear to be historically significant to me. The first refers to the manner in which China has sought to resolve political friction. The watchword seems to be de-link. Set aside present insoluble issues and work on fronts that promote trade and other exchanges. And then let those become more dominant and these other things will fade away. Or we can handle them later. While China has used this approach towards several countries, it has been particularly dramatic in the Indian case. That is, in its relations with India. Although China had made overtures to improve relations with India, it was not until after the Tiananmen incident of 1989 that Beijing intensified its efforts to reduce its international isolation by courting countries like India. The rapprochement entailed, first of all, delinking the Sino-Pakistan from the Sino-Indian relationship. India gained a small victory in the 1990s when China refused to back Pakistan in internationalizing the Kashmir problem by insisting on the UN declaration of Kashmiri plebiscite as the starting point of negotiations. The Himalayan border issues were also delinked from other matters, and in 1990 China and India cooperated in the London Conference on the depletion of the ozone layer, jointly pressing the developed countries to transfer the necessary technology to the developing ones. To be sure, delinking has meant just that and has not necessarily led to reduction in China's support, including military and nuclear support for Pakistan. Nonetheless, it is unquestionable that Chinese and Indian relations have improved to a degree unimaginable 10 years ago, and have even weathered the Indian nuclear tests in 1998, which China was very upset about. China has since recognized Sikkim as Indian territory. The two countries have opened up the Nathula Pass, these are all these Himalayan regions, made great progress on the border problems, and most of all have escalated trade between the two countries. Trade between the two, which was just $3 billion in 2000, has risen to $20 billion, and at last year's rate of 38%, China's trade with India is growing far more rapidly than its global trade of 23% in 2005. According to Jibin Gu, it is expected to touch, China-India trade is expected to touch 200 billion within a decade. Moreover, investments have also been growing rapidly in each other's companies. See here, Manmohan Singh and the Indian reforms. Over 150 Indian companies have set up more than 1,000 projects in China, and since 2005, India has become one of the most important overseas markets for project contracts for Chinese enterprises. Indian Minister of State for Commerce, Jairam Ramesh, has popularized the notion of Chindia, China-India, Chindia, a formation that combines the relative strengths of India and China in the world economy. Whether or not such a formation can emerge, there is no shortage of essays touting the unbeatable strength of companies capable of combining their respective strengths of the two societies. Indians are good at the soft stuff, this goes well beyond software, and Chinese are good at the hard stuff. This goes beyond plants and infrastructure into hard policy decisions facilitated by one-party rule. China's labor efficiency is said to be 55% higher than that of India, and India's capital efficiency, in the private sector I should add, estimated to be around 45% higher than China. Large Chinese firms have size and technology. Indians have managerial skills, R&D, and free market institutions and practices. Whether or not it is a harbinger of business synergy, on December 21st, this is slightly old, I have more later stuff, December 21st, 2005, Indian Oil and Natural Gas Corporation and China's National Petroleum, CNPC, jointly won a bid for Petro-Canada's 38% stake in Al-Furat oil and gas fields in Syria. And there have been several other collaborative measures that have appeared, and just recently there are lots of now Indian software companies that have set up huge joint ventures with Chinese quasi-state firms. So I mean, these are not peripheral matters, these are very central matters that have been established. In Southeast Asia as well, China has succeeded in isolating contentious issues such as the Spratly Islands and other border problems, and has long given up its support for radical challenges to Southeast Asian states. Moreover, the creation of the new nationality law of 1980 in the PRC clarified the status of ethnic Chinese born in another sovereign state as citizens of that state and not of China. This was never 100% clear. Except for a few places like Indonesia, this has helped to smooth the relationship between China and these states and enabled ethnic Chinese to take the lead in developing this relationship without undue suspicions about their loyalty. The booming economic relationship of these nations with China have produced a web of interdependence that ought to make it hard for any one state to act unilaterally. And this is 50 years later. Last year, in 2005, there was the 50th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, and you can see here these people are much more cheerful looking, right? They look like they're back on track, right? What happened from 50 years ago. This is Bambang Yudhoyono in the middle here. This is, of course, Hu Jintao and India's Manmohan Singh. Dignity and status regained. Is there a basis for a new Asian integration? This was indeed many of the questions that are being posed. Almost every few months there's a new Asian summit meeting. The last one was in Manila, which you went to. And where they in fact were talking about this new free trade and this, what do they call it now, the East Asia Summit or something, East Asia Council. They keep producing new names for the APEC and APEC plus 3, APEC plus 6, but the idea is very much to create a kind of an ASEAN, not APEC, I mean ASEAN, create an ASEAN free trade, to create sort of homogeneity in standards and prices. And in fact, now they're mooting the idea of an Asian currency, right? So let's see where that will go. Needless to say, China's warm embrace of global capitalism and indeed of the neoliberal order in the world has not steered it towards support of more liberal regimes that are often associated with the spread of global capitalism. Supposedly. This brings me to the second point of historical significance. China's own example has shown that there is little relationship between liberal institutions and growth, and its historical critique of Indian development and the soft state led it rather to arrive at the opposite conclusion. Indeed, given that there is a strong correlation between domestic institutions and foreign policy, it is not surprising that the PRC supports monarchical and militarist polities in South Asia. This is until recently, for instance, in Nepal. This is also consistent with its emphasis on pursuing state-to-state relations on the basis of the five principle. Nowhere is this policy more evident than in Burma, which the military regime calls now Myanmar. And so this is the last section of my paper. I would talk about the India-China relation in relation to Burma. Isn't those beautiful pictures of traditional Burma? Well, that's the image they like to circulate, the Burmese military. Burma was historically a tributary kingdom of the Qing Empire. And even in the 1920s, Sun Yat-sen regarded Burma as part of China's lost territories, Shidi. From 1949 until 1980s, Burma maintained a policy of neutrality between India and China, while China followed its policy of walking on two legs of cordial state-to-state relations and support, though mostly rhetorical, for the insurrectionary Burmese Communist Party. When the Burmese junta suppressed the democracy movement in 1988, for those of you who, this is the map of Burma, you can see how it is poised between India, China, and of course Southeast Asia. It's quite a huge country, and one thing that I want you to note is Burma has good access to the Indian Ocean and all kinds of ship routes and so on down here, and the Chinese have indeed, as I will show, built roads and railroads and so on, linking it, giving it port access to these regions in Aqaba and so on. But this is, I'm sure most of you recognize, democracy leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who has been in house imprisonment now for close to 2 decades almost, or 1.5 at any rate. This is a picture of the movement. This is child soldiers in the military rule, commercials for themselves, I guess. So when the Burmese junta suppressed the democracy movement in 1988, India condemned its actions and soon after broadcast all India radio programs from the border expressing solidarity and information to the democratic resistance. It even sponsored a UN resolution condemning the junta in 1992. The Indian stance had the effect of tilting the junta, which was called SLORC until recently, towards China, which was also drawn to the Burmese regime by the common fate of having been condemned by the international community for the June 1989 massacres. The intensification of relations between the two states led to a veritable boom in military and economic ties. China provided the Burmese military with large amounts of aid, equipment, and training. China also sought to construct highways and shipping routes along the Irrawaddy corridor, that's the big river, and planned a couple of new ports in the Bay of Bengal. Indians believe that Burma has leased its Cocoa Islands to China, which enables the latter to monitor India's naval activity and its missile testing site at Sriharikota. Until recently, Indian realpolitik was justified by its democratic values. In the case of Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Burma, and even Nepal and Sikkim, Indian officials claimed to be responding to calls by democratic groups in those countries to aid them to resist authoritarian or military suppression. India's claim has not necessarily enhanced its role as champion of democracy. There are always other interests, as we know, among all these democratic interventions. Nor has it gained many friends in the area. But perhaps the most striking about face in recent Indian foreign policy may be seen in the case of Burma. In response to the growing Chinese presence in Burma, the Indian position has changed dramatically. And at the present time, when the US is planning an unprecedented Security Council resolution against the continued detention of Aung San Suu Kyi, Indian officials are actively wooing the generals. Moreover, India's equally warm embrace of global capitalism in recent years has also induced its leadership to make all kinds of deals with the junta in the area of security, energy, trade, and infrastructure projects. Whether we judge this development to be an exercise in delinking politics from economics and state rights, or as the abandonment of democracy movement, depends, of course, upon one's point of view. Writing before 2001, John Garver, who has written arguably the most exhaustive and useful book on India and China relations, laid out several possible scenarios for the future of that relationship. Arguing against what was becoming the common view that recent trends in Chinese foreign policy suggest that China would permit India to develop South Asia as its sphere of influence because of its greater interest in trade and economic relations, Garver opts for what he regards as the more consistent historical view that the gap between Chinese and Indian interests and their relative power in the world would lead to the diminishment of Indian autonomy even within South Asia, and India would probably become a junior partner to China in that region. that the Sino-Indian relationship will in the near future be much more important to Southeast Asia. A healthy relationship between the two will benefit Southeast Asia, which lies in the natural path of these two societies, by, according to Vaticiotis, reviving the historical synergies that were generated before the era of Western colonialism. Finally, what about the ideals of the decolonization with which I began this essay? With China and India having joined the neoliberal world order, we appear to be back in the Westphalian system, which creates a competitive pecking order, but no alternative vision or route for the dispossessed and the politically oppressed. Is the emancipatory moment of decolonization finally over? I have a long conclusion which doesn't say very much, so since there is no answer to this future question, but so I'll skip that and let me try and summarize. I think that there is a kind of a new Asian order. There is certainly a lot of rhetoric and all these conferences and so on, which seek to envision new solutions, I think. And what I feel is that it is very important. Of course, you never step into the same river twice, right? It's not going to be exactly the same situation. But there are many, in the whole historical repertoire of Chinese-Indian relations in Southeast Asia and the old maritime region of those relationships, there are many different modes of interaction and so on, which can, I think, be retrieved and worked to the new kind of global order. I think. Let me just leave it at that weak ending, and invite your questions.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I almost wish you'd read the long conclusion. I'm sure there's a lot in it.
I was trying to say the same thing in a longer way.
Maybe I'll start the questions by mentioning that, I don't know if you remember when I was at Harvard, there was a long-running China-India seminar. And we often would have a China seminar and a China presentation and an India specialist respondent. And we thought that would get people, this was 20 years ago, talking about China and India, and this had rarely happened. And it failed miserably. It was Hindi Chini bye-bye.
Bye-bye, yes. Not bye-bye.
If a China scholar presented, only people interested in China would come, and the India specialist would make comments that nobody was interested in. And if an India specialist spoke, only India specialists, South Asians would come, and the China scholar was left out in the dark. So what that said was there was really one individual who could bring the two together. And I think in Prasenjit Duara we have found that individual who is completely well-versed both historically and linguistically in both societies. And it's really a pleasure. And I only wish that my father, who brought together China and India, could have met you, because he flew from Assam to southern China as part of the great effort to fly the hump.
Wow.
And of course we have a long United States tradition of India and China, particularly in the nationalist era, bringing them together through supporting the nationalists and flying from India, and the support that was good. I'm wondering about the United States dimension in all of this. It's been largely absent from your talk, except at the very end. If you could say something about that.
Oh, depends on which part you want me to interject the United States. Sorry? Is somebody trying to say something? Okay. Well, maybe I'll wait on that, since there's a question. Okay. Let me try and think about which part. Yes?
We have a problem with that gross national product, is GNP.
Yeah.
China sells more to the United States than it buys. Do we have a similar problem with India?
I'm sorry, I didn't follow. Can you say that again?
Similar problem with India?
You mean the trade surplus?
Trade, yes, trade surplus.
No, not at all. Not at all. China-India trade, I mean the US-India trade is nowhere near anything like the volume, and B, there's nothing of that kind of surplus. So India's a long way from reaching that situation. Yes.
It's a very interesting talk, and you touch on one of those big questions. That is the connection between liberalism and economic growth, right? And I think you probably can pick no better example to look at China and India to test this case. And I've done some research. I'm thinking about what happened in the Mao period. My specialist history of science. So I've been thinking about this issue too. And the question to me is this. I mean, we probably all agree that there's not one form of democratic governance, right? So can we look at what happened after Mao as still falling into kind of the spectrum of the democratic governance in the sense that, at least within the party leadership, there seems to be some check and balance. As long as you have that, you won't have disasters like the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution. I don't know whether you can draw on your deep understanding about the country's history and the enlightenment. What's your understanding of this issue?
This could be also approached from many different angles. And I have a student working with me at Chicago who is very interested in what he calls the other cultural revolution. He says that the cultural revolution was really, it's not so much the Maoist ideals, but really they were much more interested in, the real revolutionaries were interested in direct democracy on the model of the Paris Commune or something like that, right? And but then what happens is that it gets taken over by the 3-in-1 committees, right? The military, the Red Guards, and what's the third? The peasant worker, I guess. And those become then controlling structures. And so he's trying to detect the movement of the more direct democratic sort of effort, right? And we haven't yet seen his conclusions, so we don't know but there was certainly an effort. And one of the things he says is that, well, what he wants to show is that the democracy wall movement and so on was very much part of this popular consciousness of having a more direct sort of responsive government, something that the people can control more directly. I don't think should be understood in terms of taken from, certainly not from terms taken from American democracy, maybe from the French Revolution, that maybe there's a different line there, the Paris Commune ideal and so on. So that's from within. But I think what's very interesting now is what is happening in both India and China today. And I really think it's very important that we get to see the importance of democratic institutions, or at least some institutions of responsibility and accountability. Because, in both these societies, the capitalist transformation, multinational transformations have been, and these are in India, they are very much Indian multinationals also, are taking over land, and which they need for special economic zones, for other industrial development, for constructing expensive housing, and for factories and so on. And this has been happening in China, of course, for a very long time. And they're taking over rural land with very little compensation, or very unfair compensation. I mean, I'm from Chicago, and when they try to expand O'Hare Airport, there's no way you can expand it because it's over-democratized in some ways, right? If people want, they get multiples at compensation level, and then they sue for sound and this and that and so on. But this is a real problem, I think, both in China and India. And it's very instructive to see how it's been happening. In China right now, of course, there is a very active press that does publicize these, but they publicize it. But the effects, are not that strong. In India, what is happening is that there's a strong press that publicizes it, and there are some efforts to address it. But once again, it doesn't necessarily work out, right? It depends on how much power capital has. But I think in this situation, the Indian situation is working out much better, because there's so much fuss being made in the media about, and by the political opposition, usually for their own reasons, that they are addressing some sort of principles of redistribution. In China, it really depends on the goodwill of the regime at that point, unless they have been able to push that.
Do you think we can continue that model in China?
There are different ways. I'm actually very impressed. I was in Shanghai in December, and I had some long interviews and so on. I'm very impressed by how actually just gutsy and courageous some of these media are, you know. They, I really think so. You know, the point is that do they have any structural guarantees? And more, there are legal changes taking place. I think it's going to be a much slower process in China, and we just have to see how it works out. Yes?
Continuing along that line, I was wondering, when you mentioned that both societies are going through very difficult transformation, structural transformation of capitalism. Would you say that India's democratic system is more resilient than the Chinese one, and in the long run, perhaps more stable? And the second one is to ask, is it conceivable that India would acquiesce to a junior partner, given its glorious civilization, its sort of sense of dominating? After all, it's called the Indian Ocean, right?
That has